On a blustery November day in 1916, the British High Command issued a new order for a frontal assault. A young, determined private, his boots caked in the mud of the Somme, looked to his left and right at the brave faces of his comrades. They were the lions, but the man who gave the order, sitting miles away in a warm chateau, sipping his tea and drawing lines on a map, was a different breed. He was a donkey. It's an image burned into our collective memory. The heroic, but tragically naive, soldier led to his senseless slaughter by an out-of-touch, foolish general. The widely used phrase, "lions led by donkeys," has become shorthand for the futility and incompetence of World War I command. It's a powerful narrative that paints a clear, moral picture, the noble sacrifice of the common man, betrayed by an ignorant and callous elite. But what if this story, a story we've been told for over a century, is a myth? What if the men who commanded the armies of the Great War weren't bumbling fools, but faced a challenge no one in history had ever encountered before? What if the battlefield and the brutal reality of industrial-scale warfare demanded decisions that seem senseless to us in hindsight, but were born of a desperate struggle to learn and adapt? The phrase, "lions led by donkeys," is often attributed to German propaganda, but its popularization in Britain actually came much later. The notion gained significant traction in the 1960s with the publication of Alan Clark's book of the same name. Clark's work, and other subsequent historical interpretations, were influential in shaping a post-war perspective that viewed the conflict as a monumental failure of leadership. This narrative was further cemented in popular culture. Think of the satirical play and film, "Oh, What a Lovely War," which portrays a series of blundering, jingoistic officers sending men to their deaths. The image of the incompetent, upper-class British officer, far removed from the suffering of his men, became a cultural caricature. It was a useful vehicle for a disillusioned generation to process the immense losses of the war, a way to find a clear villain in a conflict that was otherwise overwhelmingly chaotic and seemingly without purpose. But the story of a general's life in the First World War was far more complex and dangerous than a life of leisure in a chateau. The reality was that these men, from the highest-ranking field marshal to the lowest captain, were trying to solve an unsolvable problem with the tools available to them. And those tools, at the beginning of the war, were tragically outdated. To understand their challenges, we must first understand the battlefield they faced. World War I was a conflict unlike any before it. The Napoleonic Wars were about maneuver, cavalry charges, and linear infantry tactics. The American Civil War saw the beginnings of industrial firepower. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared generals for the sheer, terrifying scale of a fully industrialized front. The machine gun, the barbed wire, and the heavy artillery created a defensive fortress miles deep. A single machine gun team could hold off an entire battalion. Barbed wire, laid in thick, tangled masses, could halt an advance long enough for defenders to set up their guns. And artillery barrages, capable of turning entire landscapes into a lunar-like crater field, were a new horror. In this environment, traditional tactics were useless. Cavalry charges, once the hallmark of decisive victory, were rendered obsolete in minutes. The only way to win was to advance, but every advance was met with a storm of steel. The problem was in the lack of bravery among the soldiers. They were the lions. It was a strategic and technological puzzle that no one knew how to solve. Communication was another monumental hurdle. Orders were often sent by runner, on horseback, or via a single telephone line that was constantly being cut by artillery fire. A general miles behind the front could issue an order that was out of date by the time it was received. Or worse, received after the battle had already shifted completely. They couldn't see the full picture, and they often relied on piecemeal, delayed information. It's the military equivalent of trying to navigate a ship through a storm in the dark, with a compass that only works intermittently. And what about the generals themselves? The image of the general in a safe chateau is another oversimplification. Of course, senior commanders were not in the frontline trenches, but many were far closer to the action than the myth suggests. In the British Army alone, more than 100 generals were killed or wounded during the war. This isn't a figure of incompetence. It's a testament to a command culture that demanded officers to lead from the front, often dangerously close to the fighting. One powerful example is Major General Sir Ivor Max, who commanded the 18th Division on the Somme. Max was a tough, demanding commander who believed in leading by example. His headquarters were often a simple dugout, and he was known to personally visit the front lines, sometimes even being wounded by shellfire. This was not an isolated case. Generals like Charles Kavanagh, whose entire division was wiped out in a single day at the Battle of Loos, or Brigadier General George Walker, who was killed by a sniper while inspecting the front lines in 1915, were just a few of the many who faced the same dangers as their men. These men, and countless others, faced an impossible choice. The only way to break the deadlock was to attack, but every attack was a gamble with a high probability of failure. The generals were not blind to the casualties. In fact, many were haunted by them. Their personal diaries and letters reveal the immense psychological toll of sending thousands of men to their deaths. They were men under unimaginable pressure, tasked with an unprecedented mission. The donkey myth suggests that these men never learned, that they were a one-trick pony, endlessly repeating the same failed tactics. But the truth is, the British Army and its commanders were constantly innovating, learning at a speed that seems incredible given the circumstances. They were, in essence, building the modern military from scratch on the battlefield. By 1918, the British Army had developed an entirely new approach to warfare. The initial, sprawling artillery bombardments were replaced by the creeping barrage, a precisely timed wall of shells that moved just ahead of the advancing infantry, providing cover and suppressing enemy positions. This wasn't a random act of shelling. It was a complex logistical and tactical masterpiece, requiring immense coordination and skill. The tank, a British invention, was initially a clumsy, unreliable machine, but its potential was not ignored. British generals like Haig supported its development and use, culminating in the massive, successful tank attack at the Battle of Amiens in 1918. This was a direct result of learning from early failures and pushing for new, technological solutions. Furthermore, command and control evolved. The cumbersome top-down structure was replaced by a more decentralized system, empowering local commanders to make decisions on the spot. Combined arms tactics, the coordinated use of infantry, artillery, tanks, and even aircraft became the new standard. This was a radical departure from the warfare of 1914, and it was a product of a command structure that, despite its immense challenges, was willing to adapt. The ultimate proof of this evolution lies in the last months of the war. From August 1918, the British Army embarked on what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive. This wasn't just another series of assaults. It was a masterclass in modern warfare. The British, using the tactics they had refined over 4 long years, advanced nearly 80 miles, inflicting crippling losses on the German army. They used sophisticated intelligence, precisely timed artillery barrages, and the coordinated application of tanks and infantry to break through the formidable Hindenburg Line. Field Marshal Haig, the man often cited as the ultimate donkey, oversaw this campaign. The British Army, a mere 4 years after its initial fumbling at Mons, had become the most effective fighting force on the Western Front. The British military machine, led by the very same men often dismissed as fools, had evolved from a small professional force into a massive, highly efficient, and innovative army capable of winning the war on the battlefield. The myth of the incompetent donkeys collapses under the weight of this historical reality. So why does the myth persist? Because it's a simple story. It gives us a clear hero and a clear villain. The truth that good men with limited information and tools struggled against an unprecedented nightmare, and in doing so, laid the foundation for modern military strategy, is far more complicated and far less satisfying. The soldiers were, without a doubt, lions, but the men who commanded them were not donkeys. They were a new kind of leader, forged in the crucible of a new kind of war, and they learned to win it, one brutal, bloody lesson at a time. The real history is not a tragedy of incompetence, but a story of unimaginable adaptation and grim, hard-won success.